All right, welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to unpack something that literally surrounds us every single day, yet we almost never stop to actually think about how it's built. Just consider for a second the sheer volume of data you encounter in a standard 24-hour period. I mean, we're living in an era of absolute data saturation. Whether you're scrolling through a news feed, making a massive financial decision based on some market trend, or looking at the efficacy rates of a brand new medical treatment, you're relying on the end result of a very specific, carefully constructed process. So today, we're going to step into the role of the architect, and we're going to uncover the foundations of data collection and sampling methodology in this explainer.
So how do we actually know that data we trust is accurate? It's a massive question, right? Every time you see a headline claiming, a certain percentage of people prefer a product, or some new study shows a definitive behavioral trend, there's an entire hidden machinery of methodology that was operating long before that conclusion was ever reached. Think about high-stakes environments, national election polling, or multi-million-dollar clinical trials. If the methodological plumbing behind those statistics is faulty, the entire house of cards comes crashing down. Grasping exactly how this works gives you a really critical lens for navigating our modern information age.
Okay, let's dive into this. Our agenda today covers 6 steps: foundations of data collection, primary versus secondary data, designing reliable questionnaires, the power of sampling, choosing the right sample, and finally, weighing the trade-offs.
Starting right off with Section 1, Foundations of Data Collection.
Look, data collection is the absolute raw material of research. In our current age of advanced algorithms and artificial intelligence, the quality of this raw material is literally more critical than ever. We've all heard that phrase garbage in, garbage out in computer science, right? Well, it applies perfectly here. Flawed inputs will exponentially scale into flawed, widespread conclusions. Before we can even think about running sophisticated predictive models or drafting sweeping policy changes, we have to start by scooping up and organizing the unrefined stuff of reality. The precision required at this very first, foundational stage essentially dictates the structural integrity of the whole shebang.
Moving on to Section 2, Primary versus Secondary Data. When researchers actually set out to gather this raw material, they essentially face a fork in the road. First up, we have primary data. Now, this is bespoke research. You're launching your own surveys, running hands-on experiments, conducting direct interviews. You get to dictate the exact parameters, which means the data is perfectly tailored to your specific question. But it is incredibly resource-intensive. We're talking immense amounts of time and capital. Conversely, on the other side, we have secondary data. This is leveraging what already exists out there: published sources, massive pre-existing databases, deep government reports. And in the era of big data, this is an absolute goldmine. It's vastly cheaper, much faster to acquire, but here's the catch. The critical trade-off is that you inherit the structural limitations of the original study. That data was collected for someone else's primary purpose, not yours. So you have to rigorously evaluate if it's actually relevant to the work you're doing right now.
Which brings us to Section 3, Designing Reliable Questionnaires.
If a researcher takes that primary data route and chooses to survey people, they need tools built with absolute precision. A questionnaire might look super simple on paper, but it's actually a highly calibrated instrument. First, clarity is paramount. If you ask a respondent how often they do something, well, the word often is incredibly subjective. One person's often is every day, another's is maybe once a month. Ambiguity just destroys data validity. Second is neutrality, and this is where structural flaws frequently warp reality. Take the anchoring effect, for example, where providing a specific number in a prompt subtly pulls the person's answer toward that number. Or consider double-barreled questions. Say a survey asks, "Do you like our product's quality and price?" If the person answers yes, you've literally no idea if they actually liked both or just one of those things. It fundamentally skews the measurement. And finally, logical flow. Structuring your questions sequentially reduces the cognitive load on the respondent. It prevents that brain fatigue that leads to randomized or just careless answering.
Let's move to Section 4, the power of sampling. Now, what's really interesting about this is that once those tools are built, researchers face a huge practical limitation. They generally cannot survey an entire population. They can't ask every single consumer or test every single patient. It's just impossible. So think of sampling like a literal bridge. On one side, you have your entire population. On the other side, you have your inference, which is the mathematically sound conclusion you want to make about that population. Sampling is what connects them. By carefully selecting a manageable, representative subgroup, researchers can study them and walk across that bridge to make a scientifically sound inference about the whole.
But the strength of this bridge relies entirely on representation. If your sample actually reflects the demographics and the variables of the total population, your margin of error shrinks and your inference holds serious weight.
Which leads perfectly into Section 5, choosing the right sample.
Building that representative sample divides methodology into two really distinct camps. First, we've got probability methods. This is essentially the gold standard for reducing statistical variance because everyone in a population has a known non-zero chance of being selected. Simple random sampling is ideal, but honestly, it requires a perfect, complete list of the population, which is super rare. Systematic sampling creates a mathematical rhythm, like, say, selecting every 10th data point. Stratified sampling is highly effective because it divides the population into distinct demographic groups first, and then samples from each to guarantee proportional representation. And cluster sampling tackles geographical or institutional groupings, randomly selecting entire clusters to study. Then, on the flip side, we have non-probability methods, where selection relies on subjective judgment or just plain accessibility. Convenience sampling is exactly what it sounds like, gathering data from the absolute easiest sources available. Judgment sampling relies on the researcher's specialized knowledge to handpick the most informative subjects. Quota sampling aims to fill specific demographic buckets, but without the rigorous randomization of the stratified method. And then there's snowball sampling, which is incredibly fascinating. It's used for studying hidden or highly niche populations where no public list exists. Think underground subcultures or people with a rare medical condition. You find one participant, and they recruit the next person from their private network, growing the sample organically like a snowball rolling down a hill.
And finally, Section 6, weighing the trade-offs.
So, the crucial point here is that understanding all these methods brings us face-to-face with the fundamental reality of research. It is a constant strategic balancing act between accuracy, cost, and feasibility. Now, in an academic textbook, sure, a researcher would always choose a perfectly stratified probability sample. But in practice, the real-world context dictates the method. Consider a tech company needing to do rapid A/B testing on a new app feature. They need immediate, directional feedback. A quick, low-cost, convenient sample of their most active users provides exactly what they need, even if it technically sacrifices absolute statistical purity. But on the other hand, consider a pharmaceutical company launching a new, life-saving drug. The stakes there are absolutely immense. In that scenario, nothing less than a massive, highly accurate, wildly expensive probability sample is acceptable. Every single research design is basically a negotiation with reality.
So we've traced the architecture of information from the raw foundations of data, through the rigorous design of questionnaires, across the statistical bridge of sampling, and right into the strategic trade-offs of the real world. Next time you see a flashy statistic in a headline, pause for a second. Ask yourself, wait, how is this actually sampled? Was it primary or secondary? Was it probability or non-probability? By simply asking those questions, you shift from being a passive consumer of media to an active critical thinker capable of decoding the data-driven world around you. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.